Hello everybody, I'm still in Canberra. I'm chatting today with Anthony Hill. Anthony was a journalist, a speechwriter. Now he's turned his hands to writing books. And you've written quite a few books, haven't you, Anthony?
Yes.
Well, welcome. We've got the better reading audience out there, the very vast, widely read community that we have. They really enjoy watching these author videos.
Thanks for joining.
Anthony is incredibly interesting. He's here to talk to us about his latest book called Young Digger. Now, firstly, Anthony, tell me about what Young Digger is about.
Well, it's a story from the First World War. It's about a little French boy, a war orphan, who was made a mascot by a squadron of Australian airmen at the end of the First World War. One of the airmen was so attached to the boy that he decided to bring him home if they couldn't find his family and raise him as one of their own family. And that's exactly what happened.
Bring him home to Australia.
Bring him back to Australia, smuggled him back to Australia, smuggled him on board the ship from France to England in an oat sack, and got him off at the other end in the same way. And on the ship coming to Australia, they put him in a basket, a wicker basket, and covered him over with footy jumpers and boxing gloves and sporting goods, and loaded him onto the ship with the luggage. All of this, of course, was done with the compliance of the officers and men. And the boy got on board the ship quite safely, hidden in the troop deck for 10 days before the captain found him. And he was so moved by the story, he let the little boy stay on board the ship.
Oh, what lovely.
Yeah, and it so happened, it was the luck held with him, you know. Even then you weren't supposed to smuggle little children into Australia, even war orphans. And so happened the Queensland Premier, Tom Ryan, was on board the ship with his family. And he was so moved by the boy's story that he arranged with the authorities to let Tovell, the airman Tim Tovell, land with Digger when they got to Sydney. And he travelled with Tovell up to Queensland, and he grew up with Tovell's family. It was one of his own.
In Queensland?
In Queensland, yeah. Initially they went to a place called Jandowae, which is in the central Queensland on the Darling Downs, and then they went to the coast and finally to Brisbane. Digger went to Brisbane with him, but when he was about 14, he was becoming a bit of a handful. Tovell's family was growing after the war, and he went to Melbourne. The boy went to Melbourne, and went into the RAAF there. And he stayed with an airman in Melbourne, and he became an office boy. And as he grew up, he became an apprentice with the RAAF. He was actually applying to be naturalised. And when he was about 18, which is in 1928, but being a teenager in 1928, he did what teenagers do and bought a motorbike. And the end of the story, unfortunately, fate would not be denied. Yeah. He had an accident with a taxi cab in Melbourne.
And that was that.
That was the end of the
story.
So,
tell me, obviously you've been a writer all your life. You've been, as I said, a journalist. If you've just joined us, we're chatting with Anthony Hill. We're in Canberra. Anthony is a writer, and you would probably say a historian as well.
Historical non-fiction, yes.
Historical non-fiction. So you do all your research yourself?
Yes, all my research.
How many books have you written?
Well, I've had 18 books published now.
18,
I've been very fortunate.
Congratulations.
Lately, I've been able to make the transition. I used to write for the young adult market. Schools, the books were very popular in schools, but in recent years, I've been able to make the transition to the writing for the adult market.
Right.
And this edition of Young Digger was actually brought out for the adult market.
Right. I'm chatting with Anthony Hill, and he's talking to us about Young Digger. Now, tell me, where that photo, that beautiful image on the cover, do you want to hold it up so we can see it? And I'll just do a close-up. Tell me the story about how you got your hands on that photo.
This came from a reader in Melbourne, a man called David Dawes, a lovely man. He was reading the first edition of Young Digger, which we brought out initially for young people. David was reading this, and he thought, my father was with 4th Squadron. That's a squadron of the Australian Flying Corps that adopted the little boy. Number 4 Squadron has actually just celebrated its centenary. I was up there only a couple of weeks ago at their dinner for their centenary. David thought my father was in that squadron, and he went and found his father's photo album. And there was 3 wonderful photos of this boy, this little boy mascot, with the airmen. This shows him sitting with Ted Tovell, who's Tim Tovell's brother. He was only about 8 or 9 at the end of the war, when he came to them. he was only 4 or 5 when the war started, and he was war orphaned very early in the war. His mother was killed as the German army was advancing into Belgium. His father was killed at the Battle of Mons, and he could remember seeing his mother lying dead in the garden of their house, possibly with 2 other people, maybe some siblings. He was picked up by a British artillery officer and unit after the battle, retreating down through Ypres, and they took the boy with him. And for 4 years he lived with the British Army, first with the artillery, and then with the Air Force. And it's with the airmen that he went into Germany at the end of the war, and that's when he came to the Australians.
We were chatting with Robert Macklin yesterday. Do you know him?
Yeah, very well.
Yeah, I can imagine you two would know each other. I think you're 2 peas in a pod, really. But anyway, he was saying that what's so refreshing about Australian historical non-fiction now is it's been written from the perspective of Australians rather than the British.
Right.
And I guess it's like yourself, it's like Robert, it's like Tom Keneally. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we do. We're discovering our own stories. I write, I have to say, I tell them as stories. I use my journalistic...
Which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, they have to live and breathe and move and bleed and weep. And it began really when I wrote this book, Soldier Boy, about a 14-year-old boy, Jim Martin, so far as we know, the youngest of the Anzacs. Almost certainly, though, the youngest Australian soldier to die in war. And I tried to write it as strictly non-fiction, just use photographs and his letters and what was on the record. And it just didn't work. We had to bring him to life for young people. And the only way...
We had to engage them.
You have to engage them. I had to... The hurdle I set myself was to make the young readers believe that Jim Martin was once one of them in 1914. And the only way to do that is to draw on the novelist technique of...
it's the power of the story.
Exactly, going into the internals. The externals are as accurate as I can make them through my journalistic abilities and research, but the internals of thought and emotion and speech, the inner journey, that can only come from me. And I always think, of course, when somebody's reading my books, once a character starts to speak, the reader would assume that that's Tony Hill, the author. And for me, if they don't start speaking, there's something wrong.
Yeah. Now, show me a little bit of the internal photos just before we finish up. This is a remarkable book. It's called Young Digger. It's written by Anthony Hill, and I'm in Canberra speaking with Anthony now. Really exceptional writing, exceptional internal photography.
That very crowded photograph is of the day the boy came to the squadron in Cologne at Christmas Day 1918.
Extraordinary.
He wandered into their mess. They were having a Christmas dinner. "What do you want, boy?" "I want some of your dinner, monsieur. It's so much better than the Tommies." And they let him stay, and they made Tim Tovell his guardian, looked after him. This is another photograph that David Dawes found in his album. Fabulous photograph, again, of the boy on his bicycle with the soldiers at Herdcott Camp when they got to England. The uniform he's wearing there was actually made out of a greatcoat. The Tovell brothers purloined a greatcoat.
And those photographs were sent to you by readers?
Yes, this came from David Dawes. He found it in his father's photograph album.
And
it was wonderfully useful, not just for me, but he's been so generous. David made it available to the Air Force Museum, and a lot of the names were written on the photographs, and as part of the 4 squadrons' history in this centenary year, they've been able to put so many names to faces from that very first year of the squadron.
This is really intriguing. Dion Humphrey has just said, looks like a great book. It is, Dion. Congratulations, Anthony. Well done. Keep writing. Keep telling us stories. Thank you so much for speaking with the Better Reading community today.
The next book is a convict story.
The next book is a convict story, so look out for it. But meanwhile, get your hands on Young Digger right here. Thanks again, Tony, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jill.